Jake Reynolds pulled into the driveway of his new home. Well, not exactly new. He had owned this place for years, renting it out to tenants while expanding his real estate portfolio. But for the next few months, this house in Willow Creek Estates would be his home. He wanted to experience the neighborhood himself, get a feel for how things operated under the homeowners association. The neighborhood was quiet, almost eerily so. Perfectly mowed lawns, identical mailboxes, and the faint scent of freshly trimmed hedges filled the air. It was the kind of place where everything looked too perfect, as if someone had carefully arranged every blade of grass with a ruler. As he unloaded a few boxes from his car, a voice called out, "Excuse me." Jake turned to see an older woman marching toward him. She had short, curled gray hair, an ironed beige blazer, and an expression that made it clear she took her job very seriously. "Are you the new tenant?" she asked, eyeing him like a security guard checking for an unauthorized visitor. Jake smiled politely. "Yeah, just moved in today." The woman crossed her arms. "I'm Margaret Whitman, president of the Willow Creek HOA. We have very strict rules here, and we expect all residents to follow them. We don't tolerate disorder." Jake raised an eyebrow. Disorder? He glanced around at the practically identical houses on the street. "Everything seems pretty orderly to me." Margaret pursed her lips. "We'll see. Make sure you read the HOA rulebook. I assume the landlord gave you a copy." "Sure did," Jake lied. He owned dozens of properties with HOAs, and he already knew what to expect. Overbearing rules, endless bureaucracy, and people like Margaret who lived for the tiniest violations. "Good." She sniffed and adjusted her blazer. "I'll be keeping an eye out. Welcome to Willow Creek Estates." With that, she spun on her heel and walked away. Jake chuckled to himself. This should be fun. The first fine. It didn't take long for Margaret to make good on her promise. The very next morning, Jake stepped outside to grab the mail and found a bright yellow envelope taped to his front door. HOA violation notice. "Dear resident, it has come to our attention that your lawn exceeds the allowed grass height of 2.5 inches. This is a violation of Willow Creek HOA Policy 14B. Please resolve this issue within 24 hours to avoid a fine. Fine amount, $50. Jake stared at the letter, then at his lawn. The grass was barely taller than his shoe. Was this a joke? He laughed, shaking his head. "All right, HOA, let's see how far you want to take this." He grabbed his lawnmower and trimmed the yard, even though it hardly needed it, just to stay compliant. But the notices didn't stop. Within the first week, Jake received 4 more violation letters. Parking infraction: his truck's front tire was 1 inch over the driveway line. $75 fine. Trash bin timing: his garbage bin was left on the curb 15 minutes too early on pickup day. $50 fine. Decor violations: his front door was not an approved shade of blue. $100 fine. Fence inspection notice: his backyard fence wasn't aesthetically consistent with the rest of the neighborhood. $200 fine and mandatory repainting. Jake was equal parts amused and annoyed. These weren't just rules, this was a power trip. Then came the final straw. A knock at the door. Jake opened it to find Margaret and 2 HOA board members, clipboards in hand. "Mr. Reynolds, we need to discuss your continued violations," Margaret said, looking particularly smug. Jake leaned against the doorframe. "I'm listening." Margaret flipped through her notes. "You have accumulated $475 in fines. If these are not paid immediately, we will begin proceedings that could result in legal action, including a lien on this property." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you have no idea who you're talking to, do you? Is that so?" he said coolly. "Yes," Margaret continued. "Failure to comply will not be tolerated in our neighborhood." Jake smiled. "Oh, I agree. That's why I think it's time for us to have a little chat." Margaret frowned. "About what?" Jake folded his arms. "Time to drop the bombshell." "About the fact that I'm not just some tenant," he said, grinning. "I'm the owner of this house, and you've been fining your own landlord." Margaret's face went pale. Margaret blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The two board members beside her exchanged nervous glances. You're the owner? She finally sputtered. Jake folded his arms, still grinning. Yep, been renting this place out for years. Figured I'd move in for a bit to see how things run around here. His smile widened. And, I gotta say, I'm learning a lot. Margaret quickly recovered, straightening her posture. That doesn't change anything, she snapped. All residents, owners included, must follow the HOA's guidelines. Jake chuckled. Oh, I agree. But here's the thing, I also know that HOA rules work both ways. And from what I've seen, you're enforcing them selectively. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Excuse me? Jake pulled out his phone and tapped on his notes app. For example, I noticed that house number 214 has the same shade of blue on their front door as mine, but I don't see them getting fined. And Mr. Carter, 3 houses down, left his trash bins out all night last week. No fine for him either. Margaret stiffened. That's different. Is it? Jake tilted his head. Or is it that you and the board like picking on people who don't kiss the ring? The two board members shuffled uncomfortably. Margaret, however, stood her ground. If you have complaints, you can bring them to the next HOA meeting, she said sharply. In the meantime, your fines stand. You have until the end of the week to pay them. Jake smirked. Oh, I'm definitely coming to that meeting. And trust me, Margaret, I'm bringing a list. With that, he shut the door, leaving Margaret and her lackeys standing there in stunned silence. Jake wasn't just bluffing. He spent the next 2 days digging through the HOA's bylaws, financial records, and past violation reports, all of which were public record for homeowners. And what he found? Oh, it was juicy. Margaret had been approving exceptions for certain homeowners, mainly her friends and board members. Several major HOA expenses, including a new clubhouse renovation, had suspiciously missing receipts. And worst of all, the HOA had been issuing fines that weren't even legally enforceable. Jake sat back in his chair, shaking his head. Oh, Margaret, you've been bad. Now, it was time to make sure everyone knew it. The night of the HOA meeting, Jake arrived early, taking a front row seat in the community clubhouse. The room filled quickly, with about 30 residents present, most of them older homeowners who had lived in Willow Creek for years. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her usual smug confidence in place. All right, let's begin, she said. We'll start with community updates and then address any resident concerns. Jake raised his hand. Margaret barely hid her irritation. Yes, Mr. Reynolds? Jake stood. I'd like to talk about HOA violations and selective enforcement. Murmurs spread through the room. A few homeowners exchanged interested glances. Margaret sighed dramatically. We aren't here to debate HOA policies, Mr. Reynolds. Jake stood. I'd like to talk about HOA violations and selective enforcement. Murmurs spread through the room. A few homeowners exchanged interested glances. Margaret sighed dramatically. We aren't here to debate HOA policies, Mr. Reynolds. Oh, I think we should, Jake interrupted. He pulled out printed copies of the HOA's records. Because it turns out, the HOA has been issuing fines for violations that don't even exist in the rulebook. And even worse, you've been ignoring the same violations when it comes to certain residents. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Margaret's face flushed. That's not true, she snapped. Jake smirked. Oh? Then maybe you can explain why Mr. Thompson's trash bins were left out all night last week without a fine. While I got hit with a $50 penalty for being 15 minutes early, all eyes turned to an elderly man in the back, who looked startled. Wait, I didn't get fined for that? Jake turned the page. Or maybe you can explain why house number 214's front door is the exact same color as mine, yet I'm the only one who got a $100 fine. A woman in the crowd frowned. Wait, I have that same color too. I never got a fine either. More murmurs. Residents started flipping through their own notices, comparing them. Margaret stammered. This is completely inappropriate. Jake wasn't done. Oh, I agree. But let's talk about something really inappropriate, like the fact that the HOA has been spending money without proper documentation. The room went dead silent. Jake held up a financial report. According to the records, the HOA spent $18,000 on community landscaping last year, but guess what? There's no receipt, no invoice, and no proof of where that money went. Margaret's eyes widened. That's a mistake. Really? Jake raised an eyebrow. Because I have 3 years' worth of these mistakes. Now the entire room was against her. A man in the front row crossed his arms. Margaret, is this true? Another resident muttered. I knew something shady was going on. Margaret was sweating now. This meeting is over, she shouted. We'll continue this discussion privately. Actually, Jake interrupted. I'd like to make a motion. Margaret blinked. What? Jake smiled. As a homeowner, I'd like to propose a vote to audit the HOA's finances and leadership. A woman in the back stood up. I second that. Another man followed. I third it. Margaret's jaw dropped. Jake turned to the room. All in favor? Nearly every hand in the room shot up. Margaret's face drained of color. She had lost. Margaret sat frozen, her fingers gripping the edge of the table like she was holding on for dear life. The entire room had turned against her in a matter of minutes. Jake leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, waiting for her response. You can't just call for an audit like that. Margaret stammered. There's a process. Jake shrugged. Funny, I checked the HOA bylaws, the ones you love so much, and it turns out homeowners can absolutely vote for an audit if there's reasonable suspicion of financial misconduct. The murmurs grew louder. A man in the back scoffed. I say we audit everything. I've been paying HOA fees for 10 years. I want to know where my money's going. Margaret's face twisted. This is ridiculous, she spat. This meeting is adjourned. She slammed her gavel down and stood up, ready to storm out. But Jake wasn't done. One more thing, Margaret, he called out. She hesitated, gripping her clipboard like it was a lifeline. Jake pulled out one last document. You know how you threatened to put a lien on my house over those fines? Margaret narrowed her eyes. Yes, you still owe nearly $500 in violations, Mr. Reynolds. Jake smirked. Actually, I don't. He placed the document on the table for everyone to see. It turns out, a court ruling from last year determined that HOAs cannot issue fines without a clear due process system, which, surprise, this HOA doesn't have. Margaret's eyes widened. That's not true. Jake grinned. Oh, it is. Which means every single fine you've issued is legally unenforceable. Another wave of gasps filled the room. A woman shook her head. Wait. Does that mean all my past fines were illegal too? Jake nodded. If they didn't follow legal due process? Yep. A storm of voices erupted. So I don't have to pay my $800 fine from last year? I got hit with a $300 violation for a garden gnome. Do I get that back? Margaret, is this true? Margaret's face was beet red. This is an attack against me, she snapped. You're all being manipulated. Jake just chuckled. No, Margaret. We're just done being bullied. Margaret's final desperate move. Realizing she was losing control, Margaret tried one last power move. If you continue this nonsense, she hissed, I'll personally make sure you never rent out another property in this neighborhood again. We can file complaints, restrict leases, and Jake held up a hand. See, that's where you're wrong. Margaret blinked. Jake smirked. Because guess what? He pulled out one last document. I own 3 more properties in this neighborhood. Margaret's soul left her body. That's right, Jake continued. I own 4 houses in Willow Creek, and I've already spoken to my tenants. They're all voting to have you removed. The crowd erupted. That's it. I say we remove her as HOA president, someone shouted. Agreed. Let's vote. Margaret panicked. You can't do this. Jake grinned. We just did. Margaret stood frozen, her face cycling through every stage of grief. Denial, anger, bargaining. But there was no escape. The homeowners had spoken. We'll hold a formal vote to remove Margaret and the entire board at the next HOA meeting, an older man declared. In the meantime, I say we freeze all fines and pending enforcement actions until we sort this mess out. The crowd cheered in agreement. Margaret looked around wildly for support, but her fellow board members, realizing they'd go down with her, refused to meet her eyes. Her shoulders slumped. "You're all making a mistake," she muttered. Jake grinned. "No, Margaret. The mistake was thinking you could fine your own landlord and get away with it." Over the next 2 weeks, Jake watched the empire Margaret built crumble. The HOA board resigned, facing pressure from homeowners and the upcoming financial audit. Most board members stepped down before they could be voted out. Margaret was removed as HOA president in a near-unanimous vote. She was kicked out of power, effectively ending her reign of terror. Illegal fines were voided, homeowners got refunds for past bogus fines, and the HOA was forced to rewrite its policies to comply with actual state laws. Jake? He was loving every second of it. A few days later, as Jake was enjoying his morning coffee on the porch, he saw Margaret packing up her car. She had resigned from the HOA completely and was moving out of Willow Creek Estates. Jake couldn't resist. He walked over, leaning against his mailbox. "Need help packing, Margaret?" he asked, sipping his coffee. Margaret glared at him, her lips pressed into a tight line. "I hope you're happy," she spat. Jake shrugged. "I am, actually. No more ridiculous fines, no more power trips. Yeah, I'd say things are looking pretty good." Margaret huffed and slammed her car trunk shut. "You're a menace," she grumbled. Jake smirked. "And you're unemployed. Funny how things work out." With one last glare, Margaret sped off, leaving Willow Creek for good. Jake watched her go, then pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to his tenants. "HOA under new management. No more stupid fines. Enjoy your gnomes and blue doors. Smiling face with sunglasses." The replies came flooding in. "You're a legend. Free at last. Let's throw a party. Screw the HOA. Long live landlord Jake." Jake just chuckled. Sometimes karma just needed a little push.